Hello, everyone. Uh, Thank you for having me for this wonderful Music Tech Fest. This is my seventh Music Tech Fest event, so I would consider myself a veteran by now. The title of my talk is Using Climate Change to Make Music, and it is, but there is a slightly long, drawn-out story beforehand before we get to that point. So I'm going to talk to you about some of my experiments with using data, live streaming data to interact with musical instruments of the physical kind. Um, a little bit about me, I'm a teacher. This is my workshop. You've caught me at the end of a busy day, so I'm still in my classroom. I've been making musical instruments and strange installations for over a decade now. And yeah, I'm going to now pull that face that everyone makes on Zoom when they're trying to find the button to share the screen and do this stuff. So I'm going to start up this slideshow. Should be coming. Where is it? There it is. Okay, got it. And I'm going to link. Cool. So we'll start at the beginning, which is, yeah, Twitter as a source for music. Cool. So we'll start here. My name's Tom Fox. I'm also known as Volpestraments. That's the name of my musical instrument creation experiment, sort of my artistic name. I've done a lot of educational stuff through this name, and I've put up lots of tutorials on DIY instrument building and connecting things like microbits to musical things like pure data. I'm also the creative director for Acoustic, who are a group in London who deal with sound artists and other musical inventors and hackers, and we showcase these people to the public. So we run events, or we did before COVID. We're in a bit of a hibernation at the moment. But we also curate parts of other festivals. So we've been involved with the Tate Modern, the V&A, the Abbey Road got us in to do some of their hackathon stuff. And I'm also the lead for NTF Sparks workshops. So I do free Music Tech Fest workshops around music tech for kids. And these are a slew of names that I've done stuff at, either performed or taught or what have you. So my journey into using data as a source for music began at this wonderful space called Machines Room. It's no longer in this space. It's had to get much smaller and has moved out. But Machines Room, many years ago, they got me to be their artist in residence. And I used this opportunity to teach myself how to code and start experimenting with more interactive instrument stuff. I'd been building instruments for a while, and I wanted some more interactivity. So before I had even begun and set foot in the building, I had never done any coding whatsoever. So I taught myself just enough Python to be able to get my head around the Twitter API. So I wrote a Python script on a Raspberry Pi, which could grab some information from the last person who tweeted my account. And the bit of information I took was their user ID. And that was just a long string of numbers. So with that string of numbers, I could put that into an array and have it control a bunch of relays, which are basically switches that can turn electrical circuits on and off. And then I put some motors on those relays to make some noises on a stringed instrument. So this is what it looked like. Annoyingly, I never got really good documentation of it. But on the right-hand side, you can see those are the relays, the little blue boxes, which would switch on and off depending on the ID of the last person who sent me a tweet. And then they are hooked up to some motors, which would spin and then pluck all these strings, which you see on the left-hand side. And the very first time I took this into public was at the Tate Modern for their Turbine Festival. and it just sat on the side and buzzed away, and people would tweet me, and then the melody would change, and it worked. But it was quite cumbersome. It was quite big and bulky, and I wanted to make it smaller. So the next step I took was to take all the strings away. And I kept all the motors and put them around this transformer, and then put that transformer into my amp. And that created electromagnetic interference in the pickup so that it would create these harsh kind of buzzing noises, but it would still change whenever anybody tweeted me. I did get a little video of this. I'm going to turn it down just in case it is super loud. Oh no. So this is it in action. Yeah, it wasn't the most melodic of instruments. It was pretty, yeah, harsh. I did perform with this at the Royal College of Music once. This really harsh instrument in the background of this really old, beautiful building. I'm not quite sure how they took it, but I did it. Okay. So the next thing I did was, after a music tech fest in Slovenia, I met this wonderful man called Johannes, who invented the Dada Machine box, which I hope you all know by now, because this is just a wonderful piece of kit, which allows you to convert MIDI signals into electrical voltages. And it's basically a much, much nicer way than using the relays I did. So using his kit, and by throwing it the information from Twitter into pure data, I ended up making a machine which could make beats based on the user ID of the last person who tweeted me. So this is a small example of the sort of Twitter-controlled drum machine that I built. No, it's not. There you go. So it would play on a loop until somebody else tweeted me, and then it'll play a different loop. So that's quite fun. I really enjoyed the fact that Twitter could make changes which I could not control. And so I developed it further into the next step, which is where instead of waiting for somebody to tweet me, I would search for specific words, and I would fight those words against each other to make noises. So for this iteration, which is the 4th version of using live Twitter data, I made it search for the words hope and the words fear. Whenever it was more hopeful, it would add more hope to the graph. When it's more fearful, it would add more fear. And then using pure data, I used that graph to manipulate some sound which was also being generated by Twitter, to control the envelope of the sounds coming out, and also the modulate the actual sound wave itself. So this is what this thing sounded like. I'm going to skip forward a bit. So every 1,000 instances, every 1,000 instances, the sound wave would start again and generate a completely new sound. What's fun about this is that you could still read all the tweets as they were happening, and that made me realize that hope isn't always a very positive word. There's a lot of negative connotations to hope, like hoping somebody gets hurt, or hoping a Mr. President gets COVID and passes away, etc., etc. So hope wasn't always positive, which I found quite interesting. I hadn't thought about that when I set this up. Yep. Okay. Okay. Okay, I will stop the screen share and I'll try something else. Da, da, da. Screen share with over here. Oh, no, wait. Try again. Share computer sound, optimize screen. Click that one. Click that. Let's try this. Is that better? Cool. So the other videos, if you didn't hear them, they are up on my website. You can find that at the end. I think this one is up as well. I'll play this one for a little bit more because it is quite interesting. Yeah, so it was quite interesting just seeing the sound being generated as well as the envelope and everything else based on completely uncontrollable data. Yeah, that's quite fun. So the next version of this was a lot more melodic, and annoyingly, I did not get a good video of this either. But instead of that harsh noise, it would play these singing bowls in a scale. So after every sort of 30 seconds, if the world was more hopeful, it would play the singing bowls in an ascending scale going up. If the world was more fearful, it would play the bowls going down the scale. And I did this one again at the Tate Modern with some incredible live visuals from the wonderful Jake Dubber, who did some processing work that Pure Data also spoke with. And the work that he did, the visuals respond to hope and fear as well. So if it's more hopeful, a bright light came in from the middle. If it's more fearful, it would get darker. Okay, cool. So this brings me to the next thing that happened. During lockdown, quite a lot of festivals in the UK had to shut their doors, and some of them decided to just go into hibernation, and others decided to use their funds to commission new work. This was the Aerial Festival from the Lake District, who decided to just commission some pieces based around the poem by William Wordsworth, which was called, I've forgotten. It says right there on the screen, but my Zoom stuff is hiding it. So I got in touch with my friend Nick Murray, who's an incredible artist and violin player, and we pitched them a idea that would use climate change data and Twitter data and other kinds of data sets that we could think of to compose new music based around his poem and the themes in that poem. Some of the data that we used was actually incredibly basic. So the first one we did was based on nature and industry in one of his books. And on the left-hand side there at the top, you can see each line of the poem. If it had anything relating to nature in, we would mark it green. Anything relating to industry, we'd mark it red. And if it didn't mention either, we would just leave it as it is. Then we gave each of those lines a number. If it had nothing, it was 1. If it has green, it was number 2. If it was red, it was number 3. And those numbers I chucked into Pure Data, into an array, and played it out, and it created a beat and a rhythm. And it worked amazingly well. It was a really, really simple way to get a rhythm and a pattern from a strange source. So this is, I did some more sort of jiggery pokery, and this is what came out as the raw data, sounding like this.
Through beautiful the cliff neighbors which I saw many bring as a quick village we were the reading of found benevolence and witness to the flowers left the very
So it was fairly basic. It was some rhythms and some patterns and some beats. Then we also used some of the Twitter comparisons to get a kind of melody going as well. So I'm going to play you a little bit of the first one that we did. Hopefully you'll be able to hear it. So me and Nick went back and forth quite a lot and ended up composing this using just the data from the poem. So I think Nick is a magician when it came to finding the melodies within the patterns that the data produced to create these just. And the fact that he's an amazing violin player just adds a whole new warmth and a humanizing effect to sonifying data. Um, it, it, I was afraid that we would end up with something quite robotic and kind of just industrial and just yeah, Nick's additions and piecing it together just did wonders for the end result. One of the other tracks that we did used climate data to compose with. So again, I went online and I found a bunch of old temperature recordings and put that into basically a notepad, a .text file, and loaded that up into an array on pure data to get what the sound of global temperature rise sounds like. Uh, this was the raw data before I sent it to Nick. Um, so as the years progress, obviously the pitch starts going up and up, and by the time you get to like the 1960s, it suddenly gets a lot higher. I'm going to stop there because the drum beat didn't do it any justice. But what that ended up as, I will play the final track. Once I sent it to Nick and he did his magic, and we used more Twitter comparisons. So we did stuff like how many times per second does fear get mentioned, and that would help with some of the percussive stuff. We did comparisons of isolation versus open spaces to get some of the melody tracks, like the changes between them. So I'm going to play the very third movement, which you can hear some of the climate change stuff in the background. So this is that track. So I'm really proud of the stuff that we made. I've never had um, any of my data sonification stuff sound as good as the stuff I did with Nick. So because of that, we are going to continue under a band name and start releasing more music like that. Um, so yeah, I hope you've enjoyed my talk. I hope the audio worked okay over Zoom. I know Zoom it does compressed audio and messes things up. Um, my I'm very easy to find on social media if you look for Volpestraments, and I will be seeing some of you in Portugal on Saturday because I will be running the Sparks workshop over there. Um, I believe that is my time, unless there are any desperately urgent questions. Otherwise, I will say adieu and wait for the wonderful Dubber to give me my leave. Okay. Hello. Yeah, that would be cool. Yeah. I mean, all the stuff we've done so far has just been based on data I can find or have found or looked out. So I'm getting used to using specific search terms to find data. just just the other day, I was looking up rare bird sightings in Scotland data. So it's if I can find the right data sets, then we will definitely consider um, composing stuff around that. But I really like the idea of doing future climate as well. That would be an interesting concept behind some tracks. So, yep, amazing, wonderful. I'll see you Saturday.
See you on Saturday then.
Cool.
Do we have somebody else who wanted to ask Tom something? Or was that two hands for one person? Okay, thank you very much, Tom. We're going to leave you.
No, you're welcome.
And we're going to go to Dan Hill. Thank you.
My pleasure. Bye, everyone.
Sure. Okay. Uh, do you see my slides okay? Can you give me a nod or a quick wave or something? Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. This is going to be maybe a little bit different. I don't know. You never know when you're jumping into these things via Zoom exactly what's gone before, but I heard the last 15 minutes of that and it sounded amazing and very beautiful. So thank you. Yeah, I think this is going to be a bit different, but let's see. I'm going to talk about the context of the moment we're in right now, but not obsess about it too much. Don't worry. I'm going to talk about the broader perspective around that, perhaps, and the question of culture and how it frames everyday life around us. I'm a designer by background. I'm coming to you live from Stockholm in Sweden, actually from my basement, which is why I've got a picture of the sea behind me to spare you a picture of a messy basement. I'm a director at Vinnova, which is the Swedish government's innovation agency, and a professor at a couple of other places, as you see on the screen there. Just a brief story to begin with. Where I'm coming to you from is this place in Stockholm called Enskede. It looks like this. It's about sort of 20 minutes south of the city centre. So it's Stockholm's a city of a couple of million people. But you have this kind of garden city environment right there, which is sort of amazing, actually. It was laid out in 1907 or 1905 to these garden city principles. The garden city idea was really brewed by Ebenezer Howard in the UK and some folk in Germany and was sort of exported to Sweden. And you could see this place that was very built around a super green environment, very walkable, sort of medium density, a tram line to the city center, very bikeable, urban agriculture, all these kinds of things. Actually, pretty much everything that you'd want to build into an urban plan round about now, perhaps. Sports and culture framed there, school and everything. But then in about 1935, this happened, and I'll just play this movie. This is, I don't know if you're able to hear it or not. I didn't get the option to share the sound exactly right. So I'll just play it and see if you can hear it. It doesn't really matter if you don't hear the sound. This is a propaganda film, effectively, from 1935, but it was a standard Swedish newsreel. So I don't know if you heard that, and if you did, you probably don't speak Swedish. Why would you? And what that was essentially talking about was how, at that point, 1935, the idea of the streets and the city was moving on from being a place for kids playing, people talking, community, conviviality, exchange, into basically a kind of place for cars, as you could probably tell by the many near misses there. It was beginning to lay the ground for, we need to get people out of the street so cars can come in. This was happening all over Europe, obviously, all over the world, in fact, of course. And so Enschede, that I showed you on the map there, ended up with this going through the middle of it in about 1950. 1950 it extended this 6 to 8 lane highway right through the middle of the place. And of course, it sliced the natural design lines that had been built into the thing when it was rolling around the landscape in two like this. And at that point, Sweden actually became Europe's most car-dense land by 1955. So there was this huge shift then at that point. And now if you and visit that place, I don't know if you can hear me over the sound, I'll just let it play for a few seconds. That's what it feels like. And that's about 80 decibels or thereabouts on average. I mean, it's more or less like living next to a kind of a washing machine that's constantly on. So I take a lot of inspiration from the architect Cedric Price, who was around at the time and in the mid 1960s said this great quote, technology is the answer, but what was the question? And he's saying that really we need to place technology into context here and understand the questions behind it, what I as a designer sometimes call stage -1, which is, you know, what is this city about? How do we want Stockholm to move around, or Lisbon, or Milan, or New York? Then we can have a conversation about technology. If you don't do that, you end up with what just happened in Stockholm, and of course, all over the world. You end up with a garden city suddenly with a freeway through the middle of it, with a huge amount of environmental damage and actually health damage and mental health damage in somewhere that was actually rather beautiful and supportive and nurturing before. So this key thing at technology is the answer, but what was the question? I'm going to talk about some of the questions around us at the moment. Of course, Corona is impossible to avoid. Quite rightly, it's one of the biggest challenges we've faced for a long time, but it's sort of nothing compared to the broader challenge of the climate crisis. I started writing about that when I moved to Australia a long time ago. And this was an image from the Australian fires at the end of last year, December and January, which any Americans freaking out over the west coast of America, I point out, is 10 times bigger than the American fires. Not that it's a competition or anything. It's a horrible competition if so, but the Australian fires were on an order of magnitude that was effectively continental. The smoke reached to Argentina from New South Wales, which is kind of extraordinary. These are some of the fires this time, well, December, really, January last year. And then, of course, the Californian wildfires. These are all just kind of glimpses of what's coming, just like Corona is a glimpse. They're all connected, all the same kind of thing. Corona, in some cases, is triggered by biodiversity loss, which in some sense is obviously contributing to the climate crisis. That delivers a public health crisis, which plays out along social justice lines. So they're all exactly the same connected system. So it was interesting to think about these kind of corona curves. If you remember this from about 7 months ago, the media was full of these things. We need to flatten the curve on corona. And I started thinking at the time, well, actually, there's a much bigger curve we need to flatten. And some of those things overlap with corona, which is interesting. Perhaps we can think about these curves simultaneously and understand what in corona is actually also flattening the curve on the climate, and what can we learn from that? Not to see it in any sense as a silver lining, to be clear. You do not want to have a pandemic pointed at you to have to force your behavior change, but nonetheless, what is the relationship between these two things, given that they're completely connected? If we can flatten those curves, perhaps we avoid the going into the red zone here, which is the +2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, potentially even scenarios that one could look at. We want to stay rather in the green curve there, below 1.5 or thereabouts. This graph was released earlier today, actually, which just shows the impact in CO2 emissions of corona this year, which is one of the biggest, January to August, well, actually the biggest on record since the end of World War II. The drop in CO2, we know that's kind of bounced back up in numerous ways, partly because of terrible economic decisions, if nothing else. But the impact of that was also visceral. The air cleared very quickly, as you might remember. The streets were very quiet all of a sudden. People were beginning to get out in those streets and realize that if you went in full lockdown, you could walk around in that. The water in Venice got clearer than I can ever remember it. Wildlife, to some extent, started returning to cities. One wouldn't want to overplay this as any Arcadian vision, but nonetheless, that visceral experience was incredibly powerful at that point. And we had a choice then, and we still have a choice, to be clear, because Corona's not going anywhere for, let's say, a couple of years. So this curve actually gives us a chance to think about, well, if the cars were flattened by the Corona curve happening, what level should they go back to? They don't have to go back up to where they were, despite what automobile manufacturers might want them to. There's absolutely no reason. We don't need them, to be clear. So that's a choice. Same with aviation. Aviation bosses will say it might be 4 to 5 years before we're back to normal, by which they mean unsustainable. So we don't have to do that. Absolutely, again, we're having a moment to make this choice. And we haven't ever made that choice before. Aviation's just been moderated by the market largely. Policymakers have not had to make that choice. And then Corona kind of made the choice for them. But what would it mean if we did make the choice? Same with construction, same with the balance of vehicles moving through a street, what the street is for. All of those things are shifted by these shapes and patterns. So what does it mean to do that properly? It wouldn't mean things like this, to be clear, these kind of terrible visions that were done very early on of somehow this being an ideal idea for a beach. How would we begin to really reframe the way that we think about our living environments in the context of the broader, long emergencies that we're dealing with? And this is where the book Slow Down by Danny Dorling is particularly interesting. I won't go into it in detail now because of time, but he talks about how everything that we think is speeding up is in fact slowing down pretty much. The rate of technology innovation is slowed down massively compared to, say, 1920 or 1880. The rate of population growth is slowing down all over the world. It's still increasing in places like Shanghai or Lagos, but the rate of increase is slowing down. So here's these crazy curves in the book showing, you know, the population growth in the Indian subcontinent, the overall population growth in the world, all kinds of things, growth of Wikipedia articles, average height. It's kind of extraordinary book. But the key thing is this population growth is not rising as much and as rapidly as people thought. UN predictions are coming down year on year. Not to say everything's rosy at all, just to be super clear. But still, this is an interesting opportunity because I like with Corona, again, it gives us a chance to think about, well, if things are slowing down, if the economic engine around growth is not there in the same way, can't be there in the same way because of different choices about population, what does that mean? So I did some thinking about that and looked at different scales here. So the immediate impact of what we're in right now, what if that extended? What if we were looking at new types of architecture for living in that were based around being around the idea of home a lot more? Maybe 2 days a week or 3 days a week, assuming people go back to the office at some point, a couple of days a week, depending on the kind of work you do, obviously. Some people are in work all the time elsewhere. But how can home be a place for living and working and growing and building and creating culture and art simultaneously? Sarah Wrigglesworth and Jeremy Till's house in London is a lovely example of that. What kind of environments might we be doing work in? Some people are having meetings now in Red Dead Redemption, the video game, instead of in Zoom and Teams, which I think is amazing. They're exploiting the engine of Red Dead Redemption to have basically team meetings, which is a wonderful thing. And it makes you think, well, what again, if we created tools for cultural exchange and team meetings that were actually pretty good, as opposed to Team and Zoom and Slack and Skype and so on, which are all pretty banal exchanges. A project I worked on a couple of years ago, I still work on from time to time, is a different kind of technology of the phone. This is not a smartphone. It's a phone made by Punkt, a Swiss company, which is just a cell phone. So it enables you to go into a mode where you're not distracted. There's no data in it really at all. It actually runs on Android, but we shoved Android so down in the ground that only it really pulls out the call function and the messages and the contacts and so on. How does that change the layout of the house? What can we learn from the work of feminist architects like Matrix from the 1980s onwards about rebalancing the way that the house is built if people are around it a lot more? How does this change public housing and the way we feel about that? This is the wonderful Alt Erla project in Vienna, which is public housing, social housing. I mean, it's what my friend Kieran Long at ArcGIS might call public luxury. It's completely public social housing. But look at the quality of it. It's kind of extraordinary. You can also do this with cooperative models. This one is called Kalkbreit in Zurich. These are all outside of normal market conditions, put it that way. These are not built by developers, property developers. This one in particular is built by cooperatives. Really completely different rebalancing of spaces and qualities in there. Much higher performing than the market in almost every way. So these kind of feelings and visions of the kind of world that we might be in, I don't think they're dark necessarily. They're not like the Swedish artist Simon Stålenhag pictures of the future, which is this kind of strange netherworld of 1990s Volvos and robots and flying spacecraft at the same time. It's perhaps a little bit more possible than that. This is Olela Kandrioufas's amazing visualizations of a future Brooklyn, which is kind of super biodiverse, incredibly culturally diverse, this kind of retrofitted, hacked together future, which I think is also full of high tech and low tech simultaneously. Incredibly joyful and full of color and greenery and biodiversity. And humans are in there, of course, but so are robots. So it's looking at human and non-human life in a completely different rebalancing. Totally away from where we've gone from, just to be clear again, before Corona, 50% of all those towers on the right in Manhattan, that is, were empty and had been for 5 years. So all of the apartment buildings built in Manhattan, in central Manhattan in the last 5 years, they were 50% empty before the crisis, before the Corona crisis, I mean, so in the other crisis. Massively unequal and utterly pointless form of property development with terrible outcomes in almost every measure around social justice and climate crisis. But other options are available, as I've just pointed out. At the broader scale, how do we look at then, how does that change the way that we feel about moving around and getting to and from neighborhoods and work? People hate commuting. They have done forever. This is a list of the pursuits, daily life, a sort of a daily life activity list that was done with Texan housewives, I think, and well, Texan housewives and others. That's how it was framed, by the way. That's not me saying housewives. That's how it was framed in the early 90s when it was done. The least popular things are the evening and morning commute. The most popular is intimate relations, which is a nice euphemism for sex, I think, but which is good to see that that's the most popular. But the least popular, the morning commute. People have always hated this and have done forever. So how do you break the city apart and say not everybody has to go into the center? How do you make the neighborhoods good? Well, Cedric Price, again, did this lovely city as an egg idea, moving from the ancient city, the boiled egg, the fried egg of the 19th century, the scrambled mushy egg of the modern. I prefer to think of it as an omelette. How would you have a distributed series of pockets of super taste distributed around the city, not everything piled in the middle of the omelette? My friend Rory Hyde did these lovely visualizations of Australian suburbs and how they might retrofit. This is an existing suburb. I think it's called Sunshine, I seem to remember. Here's his quick sketch on top of that. Co-working spaces, factories, play spaces, nurseries, wind turbines, water treatment on site, all of this kind of stuff. This links really to lovely work by Aldo van Eyck in Amsterdam after World War II, where he designed 700 plus playgrounds for the city of Amsterdam, the gemeente. And they were built in bomb sites and kind of disused sites like this. So as a result, it followed the very random scatter plot, if you like, of bomb sites and turned them into these wonderful play spaces. So he did 700. A lot of them have gone now. So this is a map of where a few of them are left. But you see, it's this very kind of polka dot pattern over the city, completely different flattening of that CBD model down into a much more evenly distributed and therefore actually super diverse curve. You have more diversity in the thing on the right because there's more surface area. There's more surface areas, if you like, than this CBD model, which is actually not diverse at all. So the project we're working on in Sweden at the moment is that kind of super distributed model about the street, actually, and how you begin to transform that. Every single street in Sweden, I might add. So that's about 40,000 kilometers. That's 600 square kilometers. That's like 6 times the size of Paris, roughly. Imagine all of that as addressable space, and we want to make it all healthy, sustainable, and vibrant. And vibrant just means full of life. So that could be a busy downtown on a Friday night, or it could be full of birds and butterflies and bees and quite quiet, but either way, full of life. So we've worked on that for the last year or so. We've done lots and lots of complex sort of systems workshops with engagement right across the board, getting people to work in very synthetic ways, drawing actually on bits of paper and modeling them and building out ideas of what streets can be about. In this sense, we're changing the kind of inputs that go into that thing. Usually a street is a complex system, but we've kind of made it about traffic for the last 2 generations. It's not ever really been about traffic. If you know a good street in Lisbon or in Italy or indeed in Stockholm pre-1920, it was full of life. It was full of people, as you saw in that movie, kids playing, women talking in the street, men talking in the street, women reading newspapers, walking in front of trams, that kind of thing. And we'd lost all of that. We got rid of it all. So we sort of gave it to the traffic department. And if you give the street to the traffic department, then the answer is traffic. You know, the clue is in the name. If you gave the street to gardeners, you'd get gardens. If you gave the street to musicians, you probably get a lot of performing venues, one way or another, bandstands. So how do you change the inputs? It becomes like this fan on the right. What do we put in enables us to pull different things out, different types of output. So if we want to pull public art out of the street, that means public art has to be at the table when we're designing the street. So these are the kind of things that came out of those workshops, these kind of composite sketches, lots of wonderful ideas, very much in line with things like Paris's 15-minute city, or what Oslo is doing to some extent, what Amsterdam's doing, what lots of cities are doing all over the world. So it's not rocket science, this stuff, but it is framing the street as a different place for a different kind of innovation. So what we did next was we found 4 streets actually next to schools in Stockholm. Stockholm's full of streets like this, as is every city in Sweden, as is pretty much every city in the world. Leftover streets actually being used as parking space. We built more parking space in Sweden per person than living space. 50 square meters of parking space per person and only 44 square meters of living space. Again, not unusual, sadly. So that is really dead space. That is not a space where you can do culture. You can't do community there. You don't do conviviality. So then we threw them over to the school kids, actually, because the school kids, that's their street. As the school is on the street belongs to them and some of the residents around them. And we ran these co-design sessions with them. We also ran them with the Prime Minister. For what it's worth, that's the Prime Minister of Sweden. I won't tell you who was better at this exercise, the kids or the Prime Minister, but the kids, this is what they came up with. And, you know, as you can see, fake palms and dance stages and all kinds of stuff, playgrounds there, of course. We then turned those into designs that could be delivered, let me put it that way. And then we've been working on a modular kit of parts, of which there are actually hundreds of items here. You can imagine this almost like Lego bits or an IKEA catalog, if you like. And then this is where them deployed into the streets now. And these are the prototypes live with people really using them now every day in these 4 streets. So they're made of Swedish timber. So we're softening the landscape of the street right away. And of course, timber is circular and sustainable. It's coming from Swedish forest nearby, and it's being computer controlled manufacturing. So we can kind of shape it to the street, as you see with that curved element there. We're also doing other things like playgrounds and beaches. And it's lovely seeing people adopt them and adapt them already. There's a family having a picnic in the background, and they're using this thing as a picnic table in the foreground. There are bonus points for the tablecloth, obviously. And this I'm borrowing heavily from lovely work by Michael Sorkin, the late great American architect who actually died of coronavirus earlier this year, incredibly sadly. But he wrote this wonderful book, an item called The Sidewalks of New York, about throwing over again the design to the street itself. This is in Kungsholmen, so you see they're doing multiple jobs here in what was previously a parking space. And these are designed to extend almost like a boardwalk, so you can get as many slats of that wood as basically the municipality wants to. You could have 100 of them in a line. And it's beginning to diversify, and of course there's play and all kinds of things happening there. We asked Brian Eno to write some design principles for this like a year ago, actually, and it's interesting how many of those have come out now in the project we've done, which thanks to Brian very much for this. You know, thinking like a gardener, not an architect, design beginnings, not endings, absolutely something I did with this. Artists are to cities what worms are to soil, which is a lovely quote. So in a sense, we're kind of building some soil here very literally by making spaces for culture within these things. There's lots of things about literally even wooden materials that are easy to change and so on. Underneath that, we have these complex models of the value. I'll just home in on a little bit of that because some of this is about sound and noise. Some of the things we're looking at are how bird song is sort of almost directly inversely proportional to traffic noise. And birdsong has been disappearing from cities because of traffic noise increasing over the years. And that's actually really detrimental to our health, mental health, and indeed physical health. It turns out that birdsong helps you recover from sickness quicker if you can hear it, which would be very useful right now, as well as all the other things that obviously these single interventions doing multiple things. So these kind of curves again, how do we use this moment of the reduced traffic to actually increase the amount of birdsong? Question. I'm not saying it has to be these proportions, but we're using this project as a way to ask questions in public. Interestingly, of course, most of the complaints to do with what we've just done are to do with the noise, which are coming from a very small and particular set of people, to be clear. And it's their right to voice that complaint, but they're living next to a school and they're complaining about the noise of school children. So it's kind of problematic. And actually, most people are very positive about it. But this is where noise is incredibly powerful and visceral emotion in the city. It can't be turned off, as all of you know. You can't just look the other way with noise. It's kind of there. So we're using these projects as a way of sort of holding uncertainty as kind of a mechanism that enables us to explore this uncertainty about system dynamics. This is a lovely quote from Millie Begovic at UNDP about that. This is precisely what we're trying to do with these street projects, put things in public, which ask questions in public. The public, again, are deciding what happens there. The state, if you like, the government, in my case, is building a kit of parts they can use and adapt and adopt. Their modifications come back into the kit, like an open source library, which then is available to all 290 cities across Sweden. And that's the question again, what are streets about? And in my view, this is a perfectly valid response. Ron Finley's work in Los Angeles is incredible. He's figured out there's 26 square miles, I think, of vacant parking lot in LA. That's 20 times the size of Central Park. And he's figured out you could grow 724 million tomato plants in that, which are largely in food deserts. So there's kind of that's an extraordinary thing one could do with these streets. They could be places for art. Gardens are also a place for art, as Derek Jarman's famous garden illustrated. They can be places where people are marking up the biodiversity themselves. This was a lovely movement in the UK where people started basically tagging bits of greenery in the street, which turned out to be illegal in the UK to do this. I mean, who knew? But that indicates the kind of shift we have to go through around public space. Of course, Black Lives Matter has also occupied these same streets in this last year, illustrating that streets are about politics. That's where politics happens. Absolutely, of course, protests happen in the street. That's what streets are for. They're not for traffic, again. And then this lovely work by the Australian artist Linda Tegg at ArcDes, the Swedish National Centre for Architecture and Design, called Infield, where she built a meadow in a parking lot outside the front of ArcDes. And the Swedish meadow is actually, this is called an infield between the agricultural land on the edge of the habited spaces like towns and villages, amongst the most biodiverse places in Europe, if not the world, interestingly. So she's asking a question about why are plants in planter boxes in cities in square boxes? That doesn't make much sense. They're not square. They could be like this, these lovely rolling organic shapes. We're trying to combine those with our project now. That's Linda's work. Hilda Hellström's project at ArcDes as well, which is about street furniture. Why can they be like this? These are sort of bike racks, sort of public art, sort of anti-terrorist bollards, all simultaneously. And then, of course, these things can be incredibly small and personal, like you see in Japanese cities, this kind of occupation of space like this at that level. And it really asks, again, this question of politics. Nikita Oliver put it very well. She's a Seattle mayoral candidate. One thing to take a space, it's another to turn it into something functional that serves the community. So the way we make decisions about this, incredibly political. So I'm talking about this kind of 1 minute city, the corollary to the 15-minute city, this emphasis on this regenerative biodiverse landscape here, and how you share the ownership of that. And there's really big questions here. So again, is that optimizing for brunch? I might call it this famous picture that happened in the Black Lives Matter protest back in May. We see a bunch of white folk in the foreground having brunch in these parklets. Or is it something more complex and more perhaps interesting and more diverse than that? This means a very different understanding of technology. Y Combinator had a cities initiative. They still do, but the Twitter seems to be completely dead. So I wouldn't be surprised if the whole thing's very dead. Y Combinator, the VC firm. And you can see the language they're using here about cities is just totally inappropriate around optimization and efficiency. And anybody that's been involved in smart cities, and to my sins, I have been very close to that as a fervent critic from within, knows that cities are not about efficiency. Some of the most wonderful things about cities are completely inefficient. That's the whole point of them, in fact. So the idea that you might optimize it and build KPIs around it is completely nuts. So this is, again, the question of technology comes up. Omniprocessor came out of the Gates Foundation's work to clean water. Wonderful idea. So you feed sewage into one end of this and 14, I think, liters of water or something like that. I'll check in a minute. Come out the other end every day, which is kind of amazing. It turns poo into water in that way, which is great. But it costs hundreds of millions of dollars. You can see the scale of the thing, and it sits outside Dakar, which is, so it's good. It's a good thing. But the East Kolkata wetlands outside Kolkata do the same thing as well, but at a completely different scale. So the wetlands cost approximately $0 compared to roughly millions of dollars. And they do 700 million tons of sewage a day versus 14 tons that the Omniprocessor does, as well as all of the other stuff you see there: fish, rice, vegetables, feedstock, saving in logistics through local food generation, biodiversity holding. It generates 80,000 jobs versus probably a handful of jobs. It's completely protecting the city from floods and storms and things in a way that you wouldn't really want to be standing next to the Omniprocessor in a storm in Dakar. So they're both technologies. They're both shaped by humans exactly. They're both good things, to be clear, because the Omniprocessor will scale in a way that the wetlands won't. But the wetlands arguably is far more interesting as a kind of technology. That's in line with some of Julia Watson's work. And I recommend this lovely book, Low Tech, which stands for Local Traditional Ecosystem Knowledge. And this is an amazing bridge built by fusing trees together, which has been happening for centuries. In some senses, that's a little bit like the kind of production design you see in Wakanda by Hannah Beachler, this sort of amazing melange of AI and machine learning and nanocellulose and IoT and satellite systems and what I just talked about, deep indigenous tech at the same time simultaneously. I'll maybe close with this last story about that kind of technology. This is after the fires in Australia, to kind of close the loop a bit. Some fires burnt off some topsoil in Victoria, New South Wales, maybe New South Wales, Budge Bim it's called. And it revealed underneath this eel trap system that had been there for 6,000 years. It was an indigenous Australian system. Of course, indigenous Australians have been around for about 40,000, arguably 50,000 years as a continuous culture. So pretty successful, actually way more successful than any others in that sense. This shows the level of tech going on there. They burnt off the topsoil. The water started flowing again when there was a bit of rain, and the eel machine started working straight away, catching eels. This is a 6,000-year-old operating system, which started working immediately after being presumably covered up for a couple of hundred years. So when Elon Musk gets anything this good, I'll pay attention to him, right? I mean, and this is far more interesting, far more resilient. A 6,000-year-old machine buried there, one way or another. So I think I'm just going to hop to the end because I'm just aware of time, and just skip to just to point out that this thing isn't just about indigenous tech. It's not about Wakanda necessarily. You can use these kinds of principles at the scale of the largest urban region in the world, Tokyo, which I'd argue is actually small, slow, and quiet, despite what you might think. The growth of Tokyo looks like this. This is Dorling's quote, Dorling's graph showing actually it's just sort of stopped growing at the suburbs or the edges. It is what it is. It's kind of just refining itself now. And so you see these lovely quiet neighborhoods if you've ever been there. As soon as you step off the busy metro, you get the hustle and bustle of that, but then you drop down to this very pedestrianized space. And that's largely because there's no cars there. There's been no on-street parking allowed in Tokyo since 1966. It's just not allowed. So the streets are clear, again, for culture and life, in this case, coffee. They all begin with C for some reason in my world. Bars don't, of course, so they're also good for bars. Conviviality, I guess. And it feels like this. Logistics work like this, completely high tech and low tech at the same time. You see the tech on the guy's belt, but you see he's pushing a trolley, which is about, I don't know, several thousand years old, let's put it that way. Architecture like Sue Fujimoto's building here is just extraordinary piece of classic of contemporary architecture. And he talks here about the kind of privacy and publicness of it, this sense that there's no differentiation between the house and the city there, only the depth, as if the deepest bit of the city is the middle of the house. This completely changes the way that the people in our project might think about private life and public life, by the way, when they're complaining about the kids' noise in the school that they live next door to. This nice quote from George Eliot points that out. You can't have a private life without a wider public life. It makes no sense. So the way that this works in public is something we're exploring, again, using high tech like CAD/CAM and LiDAR scans of the street, and low tech like wood and tablecloths in this sense. So what Tokyo is doing is now refining and rebuilding itself continually. It's not growing as it did in what's called the Great Acceleration. It's in a very different mode now, and I think it's a mode we could learn a lot from. In some sense, it's a bit like this famous temple in Ise in Japan, which they rebuild every 20 years. They tear it down and rebuild each time. And it's built out of wood, of course, because it enables you to rebuild. This is Takeshi Nakatani's quote about that. This constant process of renewal enables something actually to last forever in that sense. So finally, last words to Dorling. He writes about the slowdown. He says it's not all going to be fantastic, but it gives us a chance to question what our grandparents never had time to question. They were dealing with the great acceleration. We are now dealing with the slowdown. And the sooner we get our head around that, the better, because we need to embrace that. So it gives us a glimpse of a future, which could be incredibly optimistic, I think, actually. In that within that, we can actually focus on what we need to focus on, not growth for the sake of growth, but climate resilience, human and non-human health, social justice. And within that, that might give us the time for care and culture and conviviality as ways of getting towards those deeper emergencies that we're dealing with. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Awesome, thanks Dan. This is Dan. You didn't see him before because his slides started before he came on. So meet Dan Hill, and now you can see him. There's a couple of very interesting things that are happening with this talk. One is there is a project going on which has some relevance between Mexico City and the wetlands here should I be looking towards the camera that way? Sorry.
I can't hear you that very well, Michaela. If you can get a bit closer to the mic. Then.
Yeah. Is my mic audible? Right. Can you hear me okay, yeah. Dan? Is it better?
A little better, yeah. Let's keep going.
I'm holding it very close, but I think the guys who are in charge of the tech should probably make it louder for you. Fine. So yeah, there is a couple of interesting things that are happening. One is that there is a project that is being developed at the moment here in the lab between Mexico City and the wetlands here in Portugal. And I think that the team who's on this probably have picked up on several sort of hints. But the other one is that you and I talked about acupuncture points in the city. And one of the things that happened during the G7 thing, I think I might have mentioned this to you, when we were asked, how should governments interface with citizens? And of course, in my view, data-driven bicycle system, bike hire system in the city is an interface between governments and citizens, and you are actually working with the governmental institution, aren't you?
Yeah.
And some of those things you're implementing, when they are connected, of course we are now connecting everything to data. Now that they are connecting to data, they're not just beautiful acupuncture points, as you and I call them, but they're also the interface between the local government, whether it's self-governed or whether it's, whichever sort of system is in place, and the citizens. So they create more of a piece of communication, don't they? Would you say? Do you
absolutely.
consider it that way?
No, I mean, I'm interested in these, as you know, like these everyday infrastructures that surround us and how they are actually also cultural. They're about identity as well. And that's why I think I've talked to you before about the Oslo system in a way that it expresses the identity of the city to some extent. And then the way that it acts is particularly in line with a Nordic model. Maybe it shares its data openly with the municipality. The municipality can use that data for planning with, even though it's run by a startup. It's a very collaborative way of working. The maintenance crew on the system is recently released prisoners from Norwegian jails. So they train the prisoners up in the jails before they're released to fix bikes. They go straight onto the streets with a meaningful job right away in public, fixing the bikes. So that's a sort of a social justice move, right? And it sort of links to the culture of the place that you'd get there. Absolutely not usually done when you're procuring a mobility system. So I'm seeing that, you can use something as mundane actually as a bike system to talk about some much bigger ideas around Nordic model and civic responsibility and the culture of the place and things like that. Data is part of that, but so is that move with the prisoners. They're both kind of the same kind of culture at work there. So yeah, I think culture is, my background is culture, as you know, it's bound up in all of these things.
Absolutely, and it brings to mind $1 million blocks as a sharp contrast. Columbia University's work on $1 million blocks.
Exactly.
Which I'm going to have to give the crowd here to look at, because obviously we don't have time to go into it in great detail. And also, fantastic junction to Stanza, who's waiting in queue. Because Stanza? Dan, have you ever met the artist Stanza?
No, I don't think so.
No, okay, this is a really, really interesting link. He works with cities and with data, and all of his work are sort of essays about the nature of data and the nature of cities. And this is an amazing, actually, just happens to be kind of a link that has been created from what you were saying. Hi, Stanza.
Great.
Can you hear me
Hello?
okay?
Can you hear me?
We had Dan Hill just before you, and we were just discussing, cities at length, from the perspective of the changes that we're going through to sort of how do you implement, how do you look at each single city, and how do you create acupuncture points that are also data connected. And now, of course, we are looking at some of your landscapes that are made out of data, that create cities out of data. I'm gonna let you take over from here. Everyone, and a welcome to Stanza.
So I think I'm live, it's hard to tell. I've got a sort of screen, Andrew. Can I see myself on the big screen? Is that possible? Oh, okay, all I can see is your logo, and okay. Well, hello, I'm in London at the moment. My name's Stanza, I'm a practice-based artist. And the title of this talk, I think, should be something like The Emerging City. And that's the umbrella title of a body of work that I've made over the last 20 years. But increasingly, I've recognized that maybe a better title is The Intelligent City. So all of a sudden you start to hear all these little city terms, the emergent city, the intelligent city, the interactive city, smart cities. What does all this really mean? Anyway, as a practice-based artist, I do various research. And in reflecting back on my work, a lot of it seems to be embedded in surveillance culture. And for a variety of outputs, I seem to have separated that down into lens-based media as surveillance, or data surveillance that might involve monitoring of cities through data systems. And that might mean systems such as phones, wireless sensor networks, any ubiquitous technology that's embedded within the city. So my interest there is in the real-time monitoring of the city space to come to some sort of concurrent understanding of the now that we're in, the now. And a lot of the outputs that I make, paintings, software, installations, CD-ROMs, they're a result of an inquiry that might be asking specific questions about what's happening in the city. at the moment, my big question, my overriding question is, how will AI affect the smart city? So I've been working towards that, building a series of APIs, gathering data, and we'll talk about that as this talk progresses. So essentially, I'm looking at network space, and I mentioned that in terms of the way I see my practice, it's hard to avoid this idea of thinking about it, first of all, from a dystopian perspective. And if we're going down that route, then one has to think of the monitored city, of which we are units of data being tracked and monitored by everything. If we're going down that route, then maybe we can think of it in the panoptic sense, and it has to be seen in terms of what I would call panoptic aesthetics. And this obviously treads this very academic thread from Bentham's linear sense of what this is as a one-to-one perspective, to Foucault's machine, which seems to be a little bit more interactive, to David Leon's interpretation of surveillance culture as liquid. So if you looked at my work, which moves from linear-based systems to interactive systems to these generative systems, what I'm really interested in doing at the moment is creating sort of systems aesthetic where there is no content until it's remediated by a bigger system. So that's what I'm going to talk about in a nutshell. I forgot to mention, though, that I've been to Portugal 4 times in the last year and twice to Aveiro. There was a STARTS residency awarded to me, and I was interested in investigating, well, citywide, countrywide infrastructural networks, of which in Aveiro there's a company called Wavecom. And at the end of this talk, I'll show you a real-time generative system that uses all the data from Portugal as a sort of living machine, living system. Anyway, just to sort of get on the same page, it's that I'm talking to you, and you may be listening, you may be thinking about something else. How do we connect up our conscious thoughts? How do we link together using technology? So if I was to pose a question, what is the colour of the Liverpool football strip? You can probably imagine what that colour is. Maybe you don't know Liverpool, maybe you might think Manchester United. What is the colour of the Manchester United strip? So if you close your eyes, what is the colour of the Portuguese flag? So concurrently, although this is a very binary mechanism that I'm talking to you, it seems like everybody that's now listening might be thinking of a certain colour. So I've managed to sort of connect everybody up in a very simplified way. Now, how is it possible that we could do this with technology? Thinking about the idea, for example, that London is networked with hundreds of surveillance cameras. So I'm just going to share my screen. And there's an image on the screen, hopefully. Hopefully it's paused. Maybe I get a thumbs up from somebody. Anyway, if not, I'll talk on. Thank you. I'll leave it on pause, and you might see my cursor. What will happen when I press play here? It will remediate one of 300 cameras that are being networked in real time, which was a net art piece that I made in 2004 called Urban Generation, trying to imagine everyone else's perspective all at once, all at the same time. So I'm trying to demonstrate the city is full of individual nodes, units of data, us, the body in the data space, and that we're all complicitly entangled. So I wrote this in 2004. I'm just going to read it off the screen. Imagine walking out of the door and knowing every single action, movement, sound, micro movement, pulse, and thread of information is being tracked, monitored, stored, and analyzed, interpreted in logs. And critically, we are complicitly involved. So it's a key part for me. We are complicitly involved. So this was a net art piece, which meant that you could see this through a browser online. So I basically took the camera feeds, remediated them online, and expressed them back as an artwork. And I also exercised some control over these feeds by, which you'll see when I press play. Is it moving now? Play. I'll just go full screen. So this is a video of the net artwork, which actually stopped working only 6 months ago. So it ran online for about 15, 16 years. Each of 300 cameras is hitting the screen in real time. And it demonstrates this sort of perspective, this parallel reality perspective that I've just been trying to describe. So the kaleidoscopic effect is my algorithm on top of all the camera feeds that demonstrates this idea that I'm controlling a mechanism that's already thrown over the city and diverting your attention somewhere else. As I said, this is 2004. So it demonstrates the control of an algorithm in this wider infrastructural landscape. And this is another example of a similar sort of piece, except now it's taking all the camera feeds. I think this was in New York City in 2005. Except the work is always evolving in the now. It's in real time. It's ever present. It's not recorded. It has no past. It has no future. So it's this remediation of the whole or wider city that I started to be interested in through lens-based media. So if we were thinking about this in relationship to body in the data space, everybody in the city is a body in the data space. We cannot not take part. We got no choice. So this demonstrates a similar concept where the visitors to a gallery are in effect simplified units of data, in which case each person in all of the galleries is then pictured inside this globe. This is public domain from about 2008. So it's starting to demonstrate this complicit relationship, the idea that everything is connected to everybody else. In this specific case, again, it's using camera feeds to do this. So there's a whole body of work on my website that shows, demonstrates, and exhibits this in various ways. That's at stanza.co.uk. And at this time, I was also trying to express these concepts through different forms of technology. So I basically started to invest some time in the notion of, well, this word smart dust started to appear in about 2002, I think it was 2003, long before the term smart cities and long before the idea of the IoT, Internet of Things. So this artwork, for example, uses wireless sensors in the city. I'll just go reach across. Hold on, just bear with me. It uses wireless sensors in the city. Like this, if you can see, each one has light, temperature, humidity, and GPS. They're positioned down the street. This is an illustration from TSS Gallery in Norway. The data is brought from the city. It's made online, and it's then passed through this system, and it's sonified. So we're taking the real world, we're making it virtual, and then we're making it real again to illustrate this manipulation of data and the sonification of data through real-time space. So obviously we're starting to see a lot of other technologies that are embedded in the city. So I'm going to move to another work. This uses city sounds in a different way. To be heard above the noise, just to make an observation that sound can be heard as data if it's translated via the binary code, via code into binary, and then into a stream via software. But this is using my Sound Cities database, which is literally the sound of the city from 10,000 online found sounds in the database to all of these speakers. I'm just going to skip through a bit of this. So we rapidly come to the conclusion, first of all, that data is the medium of the age, and it's being made malleable into these installations as outputs. They act as frames to experience the wider panoptic space. Zooming through that to get to the next one. And similarly, the idea of information is going to be embedded in us. I like the word infobesity. This particular sculpture, the reader, is a 3D scan of me reading a book. Each of these screens that you see is basically given the title and the name of the book. And this is from about 6 or 7 years ago. It's the idea that information and technology exists outside of our bodies, and we can navigate the world to find this information, but sooner or later this information as data will also be embedded within us. So there'll be no seamless gap between our skin and the wider world where this data is allowed. In this case, it's reading all of the books all at once ever published since 1952. As you can see, I'm wearing a hoodie. Maybe you can't. Life-size sculpture. I'm going to skip through this one. Maybe you'll have a look at it actually. So it's custom-built electronics. It's currently on show. This is one of, well, it's the only work I've physically got out on show at the moment in Salisbury Cathedral. Every other exhibition that I've had was cancelled. It's called The Reader. And you can see the hooded shape reading a book. This is a similar sculpture reacting to data within the city. First of all, it figuratively shows a 13-foot sculpture of a young female. Actually, the young female concerned is my daughter, and I wanted to use a female figure rather than the atypical bloke wearing a hoodie, leaning against the wall, standing strong, integrating with the wider city space. There's 20 embedded cameras, and the audience can see themselves embedded in the artwork. So we're looking at these systems that sort of embed themselves within the wider city and use network data and manipulate it to give some sort of aesthetic. Often embedding the audience, making them aware within the wider picture and the wider collective space. We'll just have a brief pause to have a listen to the Binary Graffiti Club. For me, thinking about data as a medium, one has to think about this relationship between art and science. And I like the idea that if we navigate in space as performers, we displace the world around us. And it's suggested, and I believe it's true, that the greatest discovery of the modernist age was that it's full of atoms. So as we move around the world, we displace these atomic particles. In the after-modernist world, we could say that we're actually displacing zeros and ones. And I've shown you this sensor device. This actually scattered across the city picks over all of this infrastructural data. So this is another project called the Binary Graffiti Club, which seeks to strip us down, strip us to our lowest common denominator, where we might think that we have no qualifying mechanism to be involved in something, for example, like politics. There is no say in the politics. We're either a 0 or a 1, and we seem unimportant. What this project does is it collects political messages that are subscribed to my website, and they're a series of answers made by young people. And the Binary Graffiti Choir, they were all volunteers. They sing these messages back in binary code. The premise of the artwork in this particular case is that we all stand together all at the same time. Then the sum is greater than the parts. In other words, the whole group sings the same algorithm. Hopefully you can hear the audio. Anyway, I'll just stop there for a minute. Yeah, the Binary Graffiti Club. Yeah, I was just going to say something about that. I forgot what it was. Yeah, what I was doing there was skipping through the video, and each little part of that, they were singing parts of what is a political manifesto. Yeah. Okay, so this is a physical sculpture, the Nemesis machine, from Metropolis, Megapolis to Ecumenopolis. And it acts as a frame to pass through its smart city data. So a small city is a metropolis, a bigger city is a megapolis, and the Ecumenopolis is the word for the religious term, the whole world. Ecumenopolis, about 98. Anyway, the noises, the lights, and all the agents in this sculpture that also looks like a city is basically mediating real-time city. So it acts as a machine in this wider sense. A machine to represent the city, which is a machine, or a machine that's representing the real world, which is made virtual and made real again. It tends to captivate audiences because of its physicality and the idea of it's built of all the big lights. And then when you're confronted with it, what you also see are images of yourself, because in some of the versions, you might be able to see them here, there are lots of little tiny screens with all the levels of informatics. And sometimes you can see portraits of yourself with a face recognition system built into it. So you've got all of these different types of information converging all at once. This panoptic, all-seeing eye all at once, the Ecumenopolis. Except now it's probably in the round, it's global, it's everywhere. It's the idea of taking everything all at once. Now this should be in New York at the moment. It's stored in my garage. I have 2 solo shows lined up for this. They both got cancelled, so if anybody wants it, let me know. So it comes back to this question, what the city of the future will look like. Obviously, through smart city dashboards, we're starting to see certain sort of informatics that might represent the light and temperature, and things like Cisco Systems and IBM are rolling these things out across the city. But what are the ethical implications in the future of machine cities, and who owns this data space? So, in a sense, there's this invisible agency of which we're all complicitly involved, and we're all moving towards this wider surveyed world. Susanna Zuboff, in their book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which is really referring to the more social media panoptics of Google and Facebook and those bigger corporate values, suggest that we have walked blindly into this age of surveillance capitalism. Whereas I'm really suggesting that we're complicit and we haven't been blindly walking into this age of surveillance capitalism. These systems are designed, so they're embedded everywhere, and we are connected into them. Now, I'm not saying it's either a good thing or a bad thing. What I'm suggesting is that we're part of an entangled, stacked network of a machine that allows, well, in this case, these artworks to interrogate the city as a system. There are 2 perspective shifts here, I think, when you're looking at a work like this, which oscillate between this utopian thing or dystopian outlook. Most new initiatives in the smart city arena, because of funding practices, seek to somehow give some citizen empowerment. And I've done some projects like that, which I might come on to in a minute, mainly a phone tracking app, which seeks to give everybody that's part of the city equal access at the same time to the shared data that's on their phones by stripping it out. So it has to come back to this idea of the data visualization of the city all at once. I'm just going to skip through that. This one is called the Nemesis machine. From Metropolis to Megapolis to Ecumenopolis, just to repeat that, demonstrating our entanglement in the bigger, wider stack network of which we're complicitly involved. So there are other types of network infrastructure in the city. This particular artwork is, well, basically the lights and the lights that are being triggered within it, once it's on the wall, it's 1 meter by 2 meters, will be triggered by anybody within a 1 mile range of this. Wireless beacons built into the system basically are taking your MAC address, type of phone model, etc., showing that there is a performative real-time agency in this landscape. So this is something that I'm calling living landscapes. can hear the clicking of the relay boards, I think. I can anyway. So this is a body of work that I'm working on at the moment, which is also being supported by NTNU in Norway and Trondheim as part of an arts residency, where I'm asking this wider question, how artificial intelligence affects the smart city. And this comes to how, well, okay, so how I'm doing that is, unlike, I'm just going to put it on pause, unlike all the other artworks where I set out my own infrastructural systems, which I think was probably quite laboured and quite a bit of a mistake. These sensors are very expensive, unlike what people say. I've got lots of them. They take time to deploy and looking after, but now, since 2006, when I initiated that project under the title Sense City, on the environmental and monitoring projects, there are now lots of online APIs that will be giving smart city data. And what I'm really trying to do is to think about how, for instance, in this real-time software that we're seeing, this is a video of the software system, how a cookie jar of smart city data might be used to interpret a global interpretation. And if I run some machine learning pattern recognition algorithms over them, what sort of information, what sort of questions can we ask about future scenarios of the smart city? So the questions that I'm looking into are, how can the collective body reclaim control of the data space using network technologies? How will our AI and machine learning affect the governance of the urban landscape? That's a critical question, it seems to me. And how will technologies of today remain of value to artists as these systems become obsolete?
Lost in translation. This is a custom-made robot.
It's a custom-made robot that you read to. It's on my website if you want to have a look. We don't want to do that. Okay, I need to just exit this, if I can figure out how to exit this. Exit, stop share, and then, screen share again, sorry. This particular work was referenced at the beginning of the talk. This is the START's residency in Aviro. I went twice, and the guys at Aviro kindly gave me, excuse me, sorry. The guys at Aviro kindly gave me access to their data feeds. Right across Portugal, there's hundreds and hundreds of wireless access points. Indeed, I think Wavecom are Europe's leading providers. And I asked for direct access to, well, all of their data, which after a lot of negotiation, they gave me, well, quite a lot of it. There's one way of thinking about this, which is a real-time portrait of Portugal. So when you get on and off the bus, when you're walking under the trees in Porto, your phones basically are triggered by the MAC addresses and informational systems. What we're looking at on the screen are all the location points, all the GPS points, and all the binary data that's being re-encoded from the whole of the country all at once in real time. So it's not a piece of informatics. And it's not a piece. Well, I like to think of it as a piece of art, and it's in real time. And it's not recorded, and it demonstrates this liquid flow. And I think a better way of thinking about this that might be more helpful is to think of it as a landscape, a bit like a portrait. We have a landscape painting, and this is an extension of the idea that we've now got real-time landscapes that are entangled. Another way of thinking about this is it just looks like data, but you have to remember that the data is only triggered by our performative inherent value as we move around. If we put all our phones and switch them off, there'd be no data on the screen, so you wouldn't see this entanglement. It wouldn't be demonstrated. This idea of our collective consciousness that's somehow interwoven and entangled within this wider technological sphere is only really there because we're complicitly involved. And this is the big choice moving forward. I mean, it's not a case of the television, there's the on and off switch. It's not a case of, is this dystopia or utopia? It's that we are open. So how do we make the network more transparent might be a better question. How do we make the networks not more trusting, because it really doesn't matter. How do we accept that because we're complicitly involved, we have a say. We're a 0 or a 1, and if we stand together, as in the Binary Graffiti Club, we can exercise political direction within the wider systems because of our knowledge about this complicit involvement, and that becomes a very powerful thing. At the start of this conversation with you, I read this quote out that I made in 2004. Imagine walking out of the door and knowing every single action, movement, sound, micro-movement, pulse, and thread of information is being tracked, monitored, stored, and we're complicitly involved. Okay, well, Edward Snowden wrote in 2004, know every border that you cross, every purchase that you make, every cell dial, and every cell phone that you pass, friend that you keep, article you write. Subject line you type, packet you route is in the hands of a system whose reach is unlimited, but whose safeguard is not. So it's unquestionable. We're embedded in these wider systems. It's unquestionable. So how far back do we want to be removed when we're going to suggest, for example, that if the wider technological systems and the infrastructures are governed by an AI? Now, okay, let's not go for defining AI, but even neural network machine learning over other impressions of data might be interesting here in order to take this forward. I didn't show a work called Agents at the End of Civilization. I don't know how I skipped it out, but it actually was done in 2014, where I was given access to 44 million number plate records in the southeast of England. And as well as in real time, I hacked 300 CCTV cameras, merged it together, built a new database, then put some false information into it. And it gives another narrative. It's not to say that there's a hack there that's false and negative. It's to demonstrate again that the agency is now, the agency at the end of the civilization is now. I'm just going to put this on pause, but it won't go on pause. But there is a final piece of artwork that I've been working on. It's a phone app called Velocity, and you download it. It strips images off your phone, sorry, and it tracks you, sorry. And it's a bit like I don't know how the COVID tracking app has taken so long, because I've had this on my website for a year. So it tracks everybody in real time that's downloading the app. And that sounds like an invasion of privacy, because I'm trying to imply that it is. But I'm trying to also imply that because I'm tracking you, and because you're giving the data to a wider system, and because you're sharing your photographs in the wider system, and then re-engaging your photographs with my photographs and everyone else's, it's a bit like at the start of the conversation. Everyone in the room thought of the color red, hopefully, and could see this big waving flag or their favorite footballer or blood pouring out. They could see red. So this stacked collective consciousness can take us in a different direction. So the phone app is a demonstration of how citizens empowerment can be used to somehow do this through performance. If everybody walks through the city with the app, they can then be seen as a collective entangled engagement projects. I think I might leave it there. I mean, critically, I think by experiencing these artworks and in relationship to these issues of surveillance and privacy, a lot more reflection is needed since we've become directly enmeshed in the bigger, wider dispositional technological landscape that we're embedded within. And it sounds like, well, I think that's good for me. There are no conclusions, it's just more questions. But maybe it should be left for the speculation here, to speculate that these works exert themselves in the now. That's what I've said. So they can only be seen in terms of their own technological performity as literal black boxes, as it were. But what happens if we try and reimagine these works? Or, well, let's reimagine the Nemesis machine with its archaeological systems, the one in the background with all its archaeology of computer screens in 50 years' time. It'll look like something from the past in its relative historical notion. I think that's really not what I was trying to get at there. I think what I was trying to get at was that if we move forward 50 years' time, how will our complicit involvement in this collective entanglement have resolved itself now that we're aware that we're part of the process? I think that's a better way of summarizing and concluding what I want to say. Finally, the image on the screen is actually on show at the moment on an 80-inch screen in Aviro, hosted by Wavecom. And they gave me this address, which is Mercado Manuel Firmino. If that makes any sense to anyone in the audience, thumbs up. Anyway, thanks guys, I finished. Shall I go? See ya.
Here I am. Do I have permission to take this off? There's nobody around me? Stand back. Thank you. So, everybody, I just want to welcome Martha because she joined us today and she obviously has spoken to a few of you today and we only spoke via things. So we hopefully will have more time to do that tomorrow. Sure. But I'm so thrilled that Martha was able to join us in this lab. She wasn't able to be with us from the beginning, but it's fantastic that she was able to join us today. And I hope that you've already had some interesting conversations with her. And you really should see what Martha's work. You should hear about her work because it has a lot to do with some of the ideas that are being discussed now. I think it could be a great inspiration and a great influence. So thank you so much. Please welcome Martha Benedetti. Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me here. It's lovely to see you all here. Thank you for staying this long. I know it's been a very long day. It has been a very long day for me. And it has been this is your third long day, right? Or maybe fifth for some of you. So thank you for staying and listening to me. Thank you. I know Mexico is also listening. So Arte más Ciencia are listening. Let's begin because I have a lot of things to say and I don't have a lot of time to say it. So first, let me tell you that I'm an artist. I have sorry, I'll hold this. I have no formal background in science at all, but I have started my artistic career, so my final project for my painting degree in Lisbon was actually my first incursion into a biology laboratory, doing a residency, and I made my first project in bioart as my final project for my degree. Bioart is maybe a field, it's a very broad field, maybe it's a community more than a field. Everybody does their own thing, so it's really not a movement in a traditional way. And there's more and more, so I began in 1999, so about 22 years ago. But since I started until now, you have more and more artists doing work with living materials. And this is one of the broadest ways of describing what bioart can be described as, which is using the living materials, whatever they may be, to produce art, to make art. And since there are many different kinds of living materials, there's lots of different technologies to manipulate them to produce art. These are some examples. They're just nice images, but they are absolutely amazing projects behind these images. So I do encourage you to look into what has been done by many artists around the world. And I wanted to also tell you that I run 2 institutions in Portugal.
One is in Lisbon, it's Ectopia, and the main focus of Ectopia is to connect artists to scientists and their labs. So if you want to do a residency with a scientist and you want to work on a particular subject, we will be very happy to point you in the right direction, ask a few scientists around if they are interested in working with you, and connect you to them, and you can work within their labs. And then 2 hours south from Lisbon, we have Cultivamos Cultura. It's right on the edge of the Sudoeste Alentejano Natural Park. It's more focused on ecology, and it's the biggest advantage of Cultivamos Cultura is actually that it's about space. So there's lots of space. There's the park, but also the space where we are. It's an old farm, which is in a very small village in São Luís. It allows us to just play with anything. So there's lab there, which is more of a field lab, but you can do microbiology, you can do a lot of different things. You have microscopes and things like this, but also you have a very big barn in which to play with. And so sometimes you're working in a lab and you're doing things at a very small scale, but as you want to transform that information into an art piece that needs to be in an installation, in a gallery space, you need to turn it into a more humane kind of scale. And so you need to play with size. And Cultivamos Cultura is the best place to do it. I am obviously not the only institution, or we are obviously not the only institution in the world who does this. A lot of the institutions in the world, I think most of the ones that I know, are actually on academic institutions, are part of academic institutions, and they are from artists who started working in biology, become teachers, and as professors, they started their own laboratories, their own places for artists and students to work with biology. And now you have a pretty wide and pretty interesting network of places where you can have a master's degree fully funded, like in the University of Windsor or at Buffalo University in New York. The School of Visual Arts actually makes absolutely amazing summer schools. If you want to go a little bit further and do a PhD, the Ressenler Polytechnic Institute is one of the best places to be. Concordia University has a huge apparatus with the milieu where you can do biology, but also everything else that you can think of. And the institution, or the academic institution that I know that started, that was the first to create a laboratory specifically for artists, was with Dr. Jonat Zoer and Oren Katz in Western Australia in Perth. I think most of the professors that you see around this slide have at some time or another done a residency at Symbiotica in Perth. And it's the second time that we mentioned Symbiotica today, I think. There's also Arte Mais Ciencia at UNAM. They have an amazing group composed of designers, of scientists, of philosophers. It's, I think, one of the, I'm sure it was the first group that was set up like this. It's in a humanities department, but it connects to the Faculty of Fine Arts and it connects to the Department of Biology in the UNAM. And of course, you have institutions which are not academic institutions that exist to produce, to exhibit, to show works like this in many places around the world. So, this is what I do. And I think it's important to tell you a few things about how I go about doing my work. So my first project was Nature with a question mark. Like I said, I was a very young art student, and it was the first time that I was in a biology lab doing a residency. It was not the first time that I was in a biology lab, but it was the first time I was doing a residency. And I was very fortunate to be encouraged by friends who were doing PhDs in biology at that time to actually ask to go and do the residency in a lab. It was not very common. I was not sure how to ask as an artist to do a residency in a science or a biology laboratory. And I think that just the same as I didn't know very well what I was doing, the scientists were not very sure what to expect from an artist in the lab. So once they found out that I was not that crazy, or that I was not going to boycott any of their experiments, they just took me as another researcher. And this was absolutely fundamental for the way that I work within a lab. I never felt like an interloper. I never felt like an appendix. I never felt like they were doing me a favor for allowing me to be there, and they never made me feel that way either. They also never made me feel like I had to make pretty images from the science that they were producing. And this was very, very important. So I had to do all the chores that all the other researchers there were doing. I had to present lab meetings just like everybody else. And I had to face questions and try to answer them to the best of my abilities. What were my intentions? Why was I choosing to do this way and not another way? What gave me the right to manipulate a living organism for art was one of the first questions that they gave me. And I was 22 at that time. So this was incredibly forming for me. It also made me decide how I wanted to do things. So my projects are all about ideas, and it's about making questions. This is why nature is with a question mark. That project in particular, I'll speak a little bit more about it in a few minutes, is about what do we call nature? Why do we call it nature? And when do you determine if something is natural or not? And because of this, because it's a question that triggers, it's never about the technology that allows me to get there. It's never about the material. Those are just consequences or paths to find the right way to pose the question, the right way to create a trigger for the public to pose questions which belong in the same family. It's not necessarily about asking or wanting the public to ask exactly the same question, but at least to get close to the subject that I'm interested in. And this means that nature was done in an evolutionary biology lab, Tree of Knowledge was done in a tissue culture lab, unbiased used microbiology and plant science. Proteic Portrait was a proteomics project. I have more. Oh, do I? Deacon was about bioremediation and river pollution. The family was using BLAST, which is a software, and also using fluorescent in vitro hybridization, which is a molecular tool. Immortality for two was about generating immortal cell lines. Functional Portraits was using functional magnetic imaging. Nuclear art was again using fluorescent in vitro hybridization to stain chromosomes. Sometimes you can do the most amazing questions with very little technology as well. So growing wheat on a specific page of the Bible can also be about generating a question. But also using very, very contemporary technology like CRISPR, who actually, whose developers actually won the Nobel Prize this year. So CRISPR technology is a bit about manipulating, genetically manipulating life forms, and I have at least 3 projects that are using that technology, 2 of which are done in collaboration with Maria Antonia González Valerio, who's one of, or the founder of Arte Mais Ciencia. So to help explain this, I start with empathy. And this is not something you hear a lot in art projects or in stating methodologies in art projects. This is taken from design, actually, but empathize is not a simple thing, okay? What do I mean by empathy? Is empathy the ability to put yourself in another thing's shoes, person, thing, whatever? Or is it about identifying yourself with something or someone else? Is it about just understanding and knowing that a little bit better? There's a lot of things to be said about empathy, and it's not as straightforward as it could be, but I like to think, or I like to state, that I start my projects because I like them, because I like to think about the questions that it poses me, and most often than not because it puts me in an uncomfortable position, that I'm not quite sure I know the answer to that riddle. And this is always a fun position for me to be in, at least personally. Then I try to somehow define what is the problem that I'm trying to look at. I try to come up with ideas, and this is where I start to think about what material can I use, what technology do I need to use to make the material and the technology work for the idea that I'm working on. And then experimentation happens until a prototype can be built. And the prototype is the art piece, because the art piece can be rethought. So when I put forward a prototype, it's very important for me to understand how, if the trigger that I created in that prototype is working or not. And sometimes it really, really isn't. And so I need to go back and rethink it, or maybe it gives me another direction for the artwork, and I need to refine that and actually ask a different question with that technology and that material. So this is how I work. So I was telling you, Nature was actually based on the publications in Nature magazine by this group of scientists led by Professor Paul Brakefield. He's retired now. And they were describing how they manipulated the wing pattern of live butterflies. And I was completely overwhelmed how wonderful the technology looked, that they could actually change the wing pattern of the butterflies. Now, it's important to understand, it was a very important thing for me to understand, that the manipulation of these organisms and the wing patterns is not genetic. Okay, so they could actually alter the wing pattern of the butterflies through a non-genetic mean, which means that the manipulated butterflies would have exactly the same DNA as the non-manipulated ones. And this is why the question nature is important here. Because if there is no change in the lifespan of the butterfly, if there's no change in the mating behavior of the butterfly, if there's no scars, if there are no immediate difference between these butterflies and the wild-type butterflies, except because I decided to make them asymmetrical, which would never occur naturally, then the question is, what are the criteria that you are using to determine if something is natural or not? And should we rethink those criteria now with what is being done? I think this is pretty obvious, but still we resist the rethinking of the criteria. And we like to fall into thinking something is not natural just because it doesn't fit a somehow 19th century worldview of what nature is. To show the work, the butterflies are actually very much alive, and you can go into the greenhouse with them. They are in specific conditions because these are tropical butterfly, and they need to be at 27 degrees Celsius permanently. They need to have daylight, night cycles of 12 hours. They need to have an about 90% humidity. So it's pretty uncomfortable for us because 27 degrees with 90% humidity becomes really, really uncomfortable. But it's very interesting And the plants are there just to keep the butterflies off the floor, because if people go in, they just don't move, okay? If they're on the floor, you have to really watch out because they don't get off the floor. And you can see it becomes a little bit of a performance as well. So I do the alterations to the butterflies at a specific time every day. And what I'm doing under the microscope, you can see on the monitor outside. And you can ask questions while I'm doing it about what I'm doing, why I'm doing, what are the interesting parts of it, how is it possible to do such a thing, things like that. Why are the scientists trying to understand the wing pattern of live butterflies? There's lots of different questions. This project has actually made people tell me things that are absolutely horrible, like you are the devil and you should never be allowed to do anything like this. And other people tell me, this is an amazing project, this is absolutely gorgeous and beautiful and all of that. It's really a very emotional project for most people. Now, you saw that I have a lot of projects. I can't talk to you about all of them, or I will if you want to, but maybe on a personal basis. I just wanted to tell you about 2 projects that I did more recently. So one of those encouraging people who told me to write that email to the lab in Leiden is now my husband, and we have been together for about 22 years or a little bit more. And he's an immunologist, okay? He had a medical degree, and then he did a PhD in medical biosciences, and he's an immunologist, but we never worked together until relatively recently. So in 2014 was the first time we worked together. And he's worked with lots of different artists besides me and before me. And this is the first project that we did together. Now, this project didn't start as a collaborative project between me and him. It was actually a project that I was looking at into what does immortality mean? And what does immortality mean when suddenly you find out that an immortal cell line, which is something that is very common in labs and very attractive as a material for research, is actually a cancerous cell line. Okay, so the first immortal cell lines were actually taken from cancer, biopsied from cancer patients. And there's a very famous immortal cell line, which is called the HeLa cells, which was taken from Henrietta Lacks. And there's a whole book, and there's a movie about her cells being the most common immortalized cell line in the world, and also most commonly used in laboratories all over the world. Oops, what happened to the, oh, there. So I was thinking, okay, what does immortal mean? Why did they call immortal cell lines when they're actually cancer cells? And you know, how can we think through this immortality, aging, the wish to become immortal, this desire that we seem to have, and what does it mean to become immortal? And in this case, I decided, okay, can I make my own cells immortal? And technically I could. You need to insert oncogenes into one of your cells and have them grow, and eventually, and you will then have an immortal cell line. There's only one problem with this project, which is for health and safety reasons, and not for ethical reasons, but for health and safety reasons, I am not allowed to manipulate my cells outside of my body, specifically with this technique, but with most techniques anyway. So I was completely barred from developing this project by a health and safety issue, which I'm very, very glad was there, because I don't want to accidentally get cancer, because those cells can be reabsorbed into my body. So what am I going to think about immortality if I can't do this? And then it came to me that well, why? Immortality is a pretty important thing. If I'm going to achieve immortality in any way, why would I want to do it alone? And this is when I thought, okay, maybe the person I would like to share immortality with, whatever that means and in whatever form we do, would be my partner, the partner I chose for life. And this is when I asked Luis to join me in this project, and he did. But because he's an immunologist, the cells that we had to immortalize were immune cell lines, so cells from our immune system. Now, you may need to understand the immune system is the system in your body that decides if you are you, and anything else that is not you just gets ideally dead. So by making our own cells immortal together or in parallel, we are actually condemning those cells to be isolated for the rest of their lives, whether it's frozen or unfrozen and growing. So we did the protocol together or in parallel, but our cells may never be in the same space together. So for us and for this project, the price of immortality was to be isolated. And the piece is very much about that. So you have two cell flasks in opposite sides of the table. Underneath the flasks, you have a microscope that is feeding live footage to the projectors. The projectors show the cells growing, and the only place where the two cell lines can be together is in the overlap of the projections. Now, we've been called a little bit more radical with this second project, which is Anti-Marta. But in a way, it is very much an homage to some experiments that were done in the 60s by John van Rood in Holland, in The Hague. And John van Rood is, or was one of the fathers of clinical transplantation. So if it wasn't for these experiments and for the research that they triggered, we wouldn't have clinical transplantation today. Okay, so they were researching rejection, and more importantly, they were researching how to match a donor or an organ to a recipient to minimize that same rejection. And one important factor is actually human leukocyte antigens, which they found had a very important role in rejection. The experiments that they did would probably not have been approved of today, mostly because he just asked some of his colleagues in the lab to exchange skin transplants. And this is one of the images of those transplants. So you have one self-transplant at the end, and then 4 external transplants from colleagues. Next to it, you don't reject your own skin, but you reject everybody else's. Okay, so Luis and I went to a presentation by John van Rood in Lisbon at the Gulbenkian Foundation, and after the presentation, we looked at each other and I don't know who came up with the idea first. He will tell you it was me, and I seem to remember it was him, but we just decided not to talk too much about it. We looked at each other and we said, okay, why don't we exchange pieces of skin and make an art project out of it? And he comes up with lots of ideas, okay? Luis does come up with a lot of ideas. Most of the time I tell him, well, I know you're a scientist, but you can also make art, so why don't you make that piece? But this was actually a piece that came very close to my heart. So as I failed to mention before, one of my main interests in terms of questions have to do with identity. I love to think about identity. I think identity is a concept that needs to be rethought constantly, and it's a fundamental concept for making decisions. if I know as much as I can about who I am, what I am, or who I can be, then I can make a better decisions to what I want to be, to who I want to become, and try to get there. So anything that gives me a different perspective, that challenges my understanding of what identity can be understood as, is something that I really find fascinating. I empathize tremendously with. And one of the main concepts in immunology is the concept of self and non-self. And this is a great example of this. Rejection happens because the immune system is there, and if it's a healthy immune system, it will differentiate precisely self from non-self. And so for me as an artist, for me as Marta, the piece was very much about differentiating me from my partner. This is something I need to do periodically because we've been together for 22 years, and sometimes I just feel the need to say, I am me, and forget about this us. Not that we're going to separate, but I just need to reaffirm my identity. It was also very fascinating to me to think that in my understanding with all of this information, the immune system is actually the system in my body, or in any of our bodies, that is more apt to decide what is me and what is not me. And it has nothing to do with my brain. And identity is something that we associate with self-consciousness. But maybe there's a little bit more to it than that. And so this is what we did. So we exchanged pieces of skin. We rejected both. I have the scars to prove it, and I will have it forever. But this was also a tipping point for me and Luis's working together, because for the first time in his scientific career working with artists, his input towards the artistic concept of the piece was, in my view, more equal to my own, okay? So instead of just me looking into this as, you know, this is an affirmation of self, this is rejection, this is all that, he came to me and he said, well, actually, this is incredibly different from the way I see it. And I know I see it as an immunologist, but actually the understanding of identity and the artistic concept behind the piece is very different from yours. So let me try to explain with him not being here. So as an immunologist, he understands the process of rejection as a very quick step into something else. As an immunologist, rejection happens to create something. It's a creative process. What it creates is antibodies, and antibodies are memory. So actually for him, this is a piece about our love, and this is a piece about our life commitment to each other. Because we did this surgery and we created in each other antibodies that are memories of that person, I will always have within my body a molecule that will always remember Luis. And he will have a molecule in his body that will always remember me. And this is a lifelong commitment, okay? This is not a contract, this is beyond a contract. So this for me, it was really interesting to see how his input in the concept of the piece was so strong. So these are the two works that I've done lately that are ready. I would just like to give you an introduction on a future project that I'm working on. And because it's a future project, I only have the idea behind it. I don't know how I'm going to show it. I don't know what is going to happen. So one of the things that I learned as well in immunology is you have B cells in your body. And most people don't realize that, or maybe I should ask, How many types of cells in your body do you know don't have your DNA? Actually, red blood cells don't have DNA in them. Okay? But the immune system is, like Luis says as well, a very creative system as well. And the immune system creates B cells. And B cells are actually a result of cut and paste of DNA. So the immune system actively creates new DNA for these specific cells. And you have them flowing around in your bloodstream. And yes, most of the DNA that they have is exactly like yours, but there's a part of it that is different and was generated by the immune system. So it actually cuts and pastes specifically. So when I learned this, I thought, okay, in principle, I can take a cell of my body, I can undifferentiate it into a stem cell, and then I can create organs or cell tissues from all of the different organs in my body or cell tissue types, and I would recreate a little bit of a not very functional body outside of my body. Okay, this is actually a technique that is used to study impact of pollution into animals which are endangered, like turtles, okay? Instead of studying the turtles, because you can't just go get the turtles and study the impact, you get the turtles that are already dead or that have recently died, and you then take some cells, undifferentiate them, differentiate them again, and see the impact on those tissues of the pollution. So, but what if I do this with a cell that was generated by my body, so it's mine, but doesn't have just my DNA. It has a part of my DNA, but something that my body decided to make it so, for whatever reason. Would the cells and the tissues that I create from that one cell still be me? And how does the identity issue work there? What is the core identity here? So this is a question that I'm willing to pursue. So thank you very much. These are all of the collaborators that I've had along the years and that I'm very, very fortunate to have worked with: scientists, artists, others. I think in general, they're just others. They took their time to work with me, and they embarked on the adventures that I gave them, and I'm very thankful for their collaboration. So thank you too. You have a question?
I have many questions, but I've narrowed it down to two.
Oh.
The first one is the dumb question, which
okay, there's no such thing.
Okay. Antibodies are permanent.
Sorry?
Antibodies are permanent.
Yeah.
Simple as that. Okay. The second question was that, I'm really interested in the idea of the individual and where that starts and stops. Where does me end?
Yep.
And whether you thought about that in terms of consciousness or the boundaries of the body or community or those sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. You have a lot of questions to be answered by that. It's like, with identity, you have so many ways to go forward. You have, microbiome and all of the biomes. How many, we have less cells that have our DNA in our bodies than we have cells of other organisms. Anyway, so what does me include? And we need to change our understanding of it, very, very much so.
I have a question about the B cells. When you have a blood transfusion, presumably there are some B cells knocking around in that blood. Is there evidence as to what
Well, actually, no. So with the blood transfusion, they clean the blood.
Oh, they do. They're cleaning up the B cells.
Of many other things.
But I mean, there must have
Of
been
many other
cases
things.
where they see what happens with the B cell. It's not exactly the same as the one that carries the DNA that would
Absolutely.
be an antibody. I mean, has there been research to see what happens to it? Does it mutate when it enters another body? Does it get attacked?
I'm imagining yes. I'm imagining, yes, because the immune system is incredibly, incredibly precise. But the blood transfusions, okay, so this would be a question for Luis, definitely. But from what I understand, blood transfusions are, I'm not sure exactly what they put. You don't have a lot of cells with DNA in blood. Most of the cells are the hemoglobin cells, and those don't have DNA. This is why the blood is not rejected unless it's the wrong type. And this is why blood transfusions work, and organ transplant does not, just purely. So, but I do think that they purify the blood to have only the items that will not create a rejection. If it does, if there's a cell that has DNA and will generate a rejection, it is probably not a very big issue in terms of body, because you just, if it's just a few cells, the body just eliminates them and that's it. It doesn't even create inflammation or anything like that. That would have to be done outside of a body, but yes. There's a project with horse serum that was done by a group in French. They live in Paris. They're a French group. Now I forgot their name, but I can find the reference for that. Where Marion Laval actually had to spend a few months preparing her immune system to the horse blood, because otherwise she would have gone into shock with the injection of horse serum into her bloodstream. And I know this happened over a period of time, and then in the performance she had some stilts that looked like horse legs, and the performance was actually called The Horse in Me. And it was a very complicated process to get her not to go into shock and die during the performance. They had to work with immunologists to prepare her body for something like that. They can, but it's not advised. How do they even figure out how to do that? Someone had actually to experiment with that. Yes. Yes. Thanks. We can do it over dinner. Yeah. Thank you.